congratulations. You've made it almost to the end of Mage Titans Italy, the talks, that is. My name's Tony Brown. I'm from Space 48. Oh, turn this on. And I'm going to be talking to you today about monitoring your cache effectiveness in Magento 2. As I mentioned, I'm from Space 48. I've been working with Magento for some time now, and I've the honor of being recognized as one of the Magento Masters for 2017. So I just wanted to start by saying that I'm going to talk about the full page cache in Magento 2 today, and understanding its effectiveness. But the full page cache is not an excuse for having poor performance underneath. Any code that we write for Magento, we need to ensure that it is as performant as possible. The full page cache is just a layer on top to really push the performance as far as it can go. So we really need to bear that in mind, so I just wanted to mention that first. So Magento 2 full page cache. I'm going to start by giving just a little bit of an overview, a brief overview of how FPC works in M2, before I move on to understanding and monitoring its effectiveness. So it is quite complex, so if you do have any queries, you want to understand more about it, then I'm more than happy if afterwards you want to ask Sherry. Only joking. There's lots of people here. Mage Titans is about collaborating. Obviously, I will talk about it at length as well. So moving on. For full page cache in Magento 2, it differs from M1 in that we have it across the board. We've got it in both the community solution and enterprise. We didn't have Varnish in the core version of Magento 1 in enterprise. However, there were community extensions that came out that offered different types of full page cache, including Varnish. But now we have it in the core, and it's consistent across the products. So I'm just going to briefly try and give an explanation on how this works. So what is Varnish? It's a piece of software in itself and a service that can run in front of your web server. So this will be receiving the request to the site, to your domain, instead of the web server. And in this scenario at the top, this is what we're aiming for. This is what's known as a cache hit. So as the request comes in, Varnish receives that URL request. And if it has previously received that request and stored a copy of the page, then it'll respond directly back to the client with the page. And the web server doesn't load, MySQL doesn't load, PHP, Magento does not know that that request happened for that individual request. And it's important to note that Varnish is sat there for all these requests. I'm talking about full page cache and understanding that performance today, but actually any request to the URL, be it JS, CSS assets, images, etc., they will also be cached. The bottom scenario that we have here is what happens when a request comes in and Varnish does not have a cached copy of that URL content. This is known as a cache miss. It's passed back to the server, and that's when Magento will kick in, render all that content, pass it back to Varnish, which is then passed back to the client. When this is passed back, utilizing HTTP headers in the response, Magento will be effectively instructing Varnish whether to hold on to that copy of the content and cache it. Because there are some scenarios that we actually don't want Varnish to cache that page. For example, the admin for the checkout, that is how Magento is configured as standard to not cache those pages. So advantages over Magento 1's full page cache. As I mentioned, we've got Varnish, and that makes it one hell of a lot faster. Varnish is purely designed to respond back as fast as possible, and we get a really big performance jump. And because we have this implemented in the core, as I said, across community and enterprise, it it means our approach should be consistent. You know, if we're working with default theming, then we know that extensions are going to be designed to work with this implementation of full page cache. We've not got full page cache by some other provider, or we have to make it work with enterprise. Also, because it's in the core now, we should be benefiting from improvements as they come through, and indeed we can contribute to the core, and everybody benefits from this single approach. So when I'm talking about the effectiveness of the full page cache, what am I really talking about? Well, really what we want to do is have the fastest application possible, and that can be achieved by reducing the requests reaching the full page, the full application to an absolute minimum. We want Varnish to, in other words, cache as much as possible. Following on from that, we only want to invalidate data when it's absolutely necessary, and keep those invalidations down to a minimum, so that, again, we're maintaining as much information in that cache as possible. So if we were just working with a very simple catalog brochure site that wasn't Magento, and we were trying to put caching in front, it'd be quite simple if that content isn't going to change. But with e-commerce and Magento, we know that there's lots of moving parts, data's updated constantly, so there is going to be a lot of invalidation happening. But what we're saying here is, for it to be effective, we want more hits and less misses. So the challenge is in how. Well, thankfully, Magento did this bit for us. They've created this full-page cache mechanism that, you know, is building on understood technology here, but sort of bringing together what they've seen as the best approach. So we've got Varnish. They provide the configuration file and all the detailed instructions on the dev docs, the core code there. It supports tagging, as M1 did, which means when that request comes through to Magento and it replies back to Varnish with the page, there's also a HTTP header sent along with it with a list of tags. These tags represent the content that is on that page, and that then means that when the time comes for some of that content to change, Magento can pass a flush command back to Varnish with the individual tag, and then only the URLs that need to be are going to get invalidated from the cache. So we're really empowered to target and remove only what is required. I'm not going to go into too much detail on these two bits, but I think it's important to mention that the pages coming back from Magento will be generic content. There shouldn't be any content that's deemed as private that makes the page unique to the visitor stored in Varnish. The way that that's handled is via a subsequent extra request via Ajax that pulls in just that private content. That is then, once the page has been delivered, is rendered on the front end client side, and the private areas are updated from there. Lastly, we've also got the ability to independently cache or invalidate elements on the page at block level. So we can define a block so that it can be independently cached. A really good example of this in core Magento is the navigation menu on the front end. So that, by default, is cached independently from the whole page. And it's probably too complex to go into right now, but that uses edge-side includes in Varnish, and is really quite powerful. Have to be careful not to overuse that. Magento do keep that use to a minimum. So why is it important? Why do we care? You know, it's just there. It'll work, right? Well, as we mentioned, performance is important. What Magento provided here is something that will work on a vanilla site. We're given a default theme and default functionality that's going to cache things very well and invalidate them efficiently. but we're going to customize it. That's the power of Magento. We're going to include extensions, our own code, our own theme. And unfortunately, we can make that less efficient. We can break it even. And if we do break it, then it's ultimately going to hurt conversion, which makes me sad. It will make probably someone angry because you're not actually making as much money on that store as you should be. So we need to be aware of it. But how can we tell? So Varnish does ship with several command line tools with it that can help, if you take the time to learn them, really interrogate what is happening in Varnish, such as Varnish Stat, that will give quite interesting statistical information, general hit rates. Varnish Top will give, if you pass in certain querying parameters, data on the most recurring events, so you can start to understand perhaps popular URLs or things that aren't being cached. Varnish Log, if somebody walks past your machine while you're looking at Varnish Log, they probably think you're Neo programming the Matrix because it's a stream of information. You really need to be, you have to have strong grep game to work with Varnish Log. But these can give you the information, it's just hard work, and you have to log into a server to see it. And the other challenge is, as I mentioned, Varnish is not only dealing with Magento page requests, it's also getting hits and misses for all the static assets. So when you just look at a plain hit rate, actually the information you're getting is completely muddied by the fact that all the images are being cached, and you're not really getting a true representation of how it's performing. So what can we do about this? Well, for Magento 1, there was a module that was created by a guy called Max Chadwick at Something Digital that we use and have used very successfully, called Page Cache Hit Rate. And what this will do is create a basic log of page requests containing this data, the time, URL, whether it's a hit or miss. M1 has the concept of a partial hit as well, but we'll gloss over that. And also the route that was responsible in Magento, the controller that was used to make that response from that URL. And from that, you could push this into whatever software you like to use for your logs, whether you're using some sort of centralized login. We actually use New Relic, and this enables us then to get nice graphical representations of what's going on. So in here we can see blues are miss, yellows are hits, and it's also got the partials. And because you can sort of query this log data, you can start to get some really interesting information. So this is a report of misses per route, so that we can see which controllers are responsible for the most misses. So can we use the same approach in Magento 2? Not quite. As we said before, when we have a hit, Magento doesn't know about that hit. I mean, that's a good thing because it does it really fast, but we can't just have a Magento module that's going to analyze whether we've got hits and misses because it doesn't even get there. But thankfully, we can do something similar. There's another command line tool that ships with Varnish called Varnish NCSA. And what this simply does is generate something very similar to an access log for your web server. So it's logging out all the requests that Varnish is dealing with. And by standard, it will look like an Apache log. But what you can do is customize the format of this log. And what's really good is you can add in extra variables and data that Varnish knows about, specifically whether it's a hit or a miss. So with this command, we can very simply start to generate a log of the similar data with the hit or miss. But we do have a problem there in that we'll still be getting all the requests for all the images, all the static assets, so we're not still getting the level of data that we need. And also, we're missing the route that was used to generate that page. But there is a way around it. So if we just create a very, very simple Magento 2 module, we can add an additional HTTP header that will add the full action name, effectively the controller. So this response that comes back from Magento to Varnish will contain, in this example, that's the home page, the route that was used to generate the page. It was mentioned before about these headers. There are other headers that Magento use in this way. And this is the Varnish configuration file, because there's one little bit of cleanup that we do, which is that header that's getting passed back, saying the route, will come back from Magento to Varnish, but it'll also get passed back to the client. And that would mean if you viewed the headers of that page, you would see the route that was used. Doesn't really mean too much to a visitor, but it's generally best practice to hide any data that's not necessary. So we can just add in an additional configuration setting in Varnish here to remove that. So what we have now, we'll have the route that we can add into our format here, and we'll get that as an additional element in our log, but we'll still be getting the CSS and the JS requests. But you can also, with Varnish NCSA, add in a query parameter. So basically we add in, I only want to log out entries that do have a route set. So now we've got all that data streaming into a log, much as the M1 module would do, for you to pull into whatever software you need to then be able to just analyze how effective is my full page cache performing. There's one thing here, though, you might have seen in the Magento module that we've got a condition here saying, is this cacheable? And all that really is looking at is, we don't want to get visibility of misses that we know are going to be misses, such as all the admin requests. There's no point us getting those, because that doesn't help us identify a problem with caching that isn't caching properly. So in that method, we just have, is it a back-end controller? Is it the checkout? Places we know that shouldn't be cacheable. And then we push then this again into New Relic, and you start to get a graph like this, which is hits on the top and misses on the bottom over time. You can see the hits are starting to get more and more. So I thought it'd be good to just give a couple of examples of how we've utilized this monitoring to identify some problems. But I'd actually like to ask anybody here to stick the hand up if they can have a guess at what the problem actually is. So firstly, we have this. So this is showing misses per route. And we can see there's a disproportionate amount of misses. I don't know if you can quite see this. This is the catalog product view controller. So we're getting a hell of a lot of misses to catalog product view. There was actually another graph I've not included. What we looked at this afterwards, we reported just on that controller, just catalog product view, hits and misses, and all we had was misses. Does anybody want to hazard a guess as to why that might be? Go on, John. Yes. We've got some chocolates we can pass to him or something. Beware of cacheable equals false. Can I just have a show of hands of who knows about cacheable equal false and what it does? So there's still a fair few people that aren't, and we need to make sure people do. Because the effect of this, if you set this as an attribute in your layout XML for a block, you may think that you're just saying, hey, my block is not going to be cached anymore. But the actual effect is wherever that block appears, the entire page will not be cached. And in that example, that had been added to a product page, the product layout handle, and therefore that page was not going to be cached anymore. So challenge number 2. This is a graph just showing misses versus hits, and the misses are in blue. So we could see this is almost like a working day. Well, it's an afternoon of a working day. And we can see that we're starting to build up some cache, but then it's jumping up, but then we seem to start to build it up. Anybody got an idea what might be going on? Sander? Yes, more chocolates or something. What are we giving out? Yeah, now, they could come from many different places. It could be an integration that's not behaving as it should, flushing too much information. But actually, in this case, amazingly, it was a new person that had joined their business who had worked with Magento before, so had not gone through any training when they joined the business, and they were updating CMS blocks and pages and believed that they needed to do a full flush whenever they did it. So basically, during the day, they were just killing the entire cache. Now, the effectiveness of this on the site is obviously varied depending on how busy the site is, but some people are going to be getting a worse experience than they should be. So he was told not to do that. So what next after this? Well, this has been working quite well for us, but we've actually looking at, because we're using New Relic specifically, we're looking at doing a native New Relic plugin. They support plugins, but that would mean that it'd be very easy for us to roll that out across projects, because all we would have to do is install the plugin, and that would give us all the different graphs that we would need for this level of reporting. Also, we've started thinking about what other information would be useful, such as the amount that does get flushed from the cache based on one action. We've seen problems before where tags have got misused, and where one product save could wipe every single product out of the full page cache. So getting visibility of that would be good. Okay, that's me. Thank you very much.